right. Good afternoon. Welcome everyone to our installment of the research seminar lecture series here at CRP. It is my pleasure today that we're going to have Dr. Timon McPhearson as our guest speaker today. Before we get started, I would like to have our four students give their land acknowledgement.
Cornell University is located on the traditional homelands of the Gayapono, the Cayuga Nation.
The Gayapono are members of the Ordinance Family of Antiquity, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence in this land.
The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America.
We acknowledge the painful history of Gayapono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of Gayapono people, past and present, to these lands and waters.
So coming up in the lecture series next week, which is the colloquium lecture, we will have Robin Nagel, who is a resident anthropologist of New York City, coming up to talk about New York City and its waste streams and how we can understand society through the waste that it produces. This is in preparation for the New York City field trip. So even if you're going in the spring, it will still be relevant for that conversation. The week after that, which is the next in the research seminar lecture series, we're going to have Dr. Kian Gall here in person. She'll be speaking about her new book, Form and Flow, and looking forward very much to engaging with you all. Today, we have another speaker from New York City, also in preparation for the field trip. Dr. Timon McPhearson is Professor of Urban Ecology, Director of the Urban Systems Lab, and Research Faculty at the Tishman Environment and Design Center at the New School. He is a Senior Research Fellow at the Carey Institute of Ecosystem Studies and at the Stockholm Resilience Center at Stockholm University, and an affiliate of the Bayer Institute of Ecological Economics at the Swedish Royal Academy of Sciences. He is a lead author for the IPCC, a member of the World Economic Forum Global Commission on Biodiversity. He studies the ecology in, of, and for cities to advance resilience, sustainability, and justice. He publishes in scientific journals such as Nature, Nature Climate Change, and Bioscience, and books such as Urban Planet, Resilient and Resilient Urban Futures, and in popular press like The Nature of Cities, which is a great blog that's open, and I encourage you all to explore that. He co-leads the U.S. National Science Foundation Urban Resilience to Extreme Weather-Related Events Sustainability Research Network, the NSF Converting Socioecological Technological Systems for Urban Resilience Project, and the NSF Nature-Based Solutions for Urban Resilience in the Anthropocene Global Network of Networks. His work is read and covered widely, including The Guardian, The New York Times, The Nation, and more. We really can't be in this field without knowing the work of Dr. Timon McPhearson, and it's my great pleasure today to welcome him to talk about climate risks, nature-based solutions, and equity in New York City.
Okay, Linda, thank you so much for the kind introduction, and I'm glad we all got a chance to take a little deep breath and relax before we sort of jump into a bunch of data. As Linda said, I'm Timon McPhearson. I direct the Research Center of the Urban Systems Lab at the New School in Manhattan, and it's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much, Linda, for the kind invitation, and to the department for hosting me. I'm really looking forward to spending some time talking with you and listening to some of your questions and getting into a discussion about these topics. I'm going to talk about the New York City context for really understanding climate risks, the way in which we're thinking about the disproportionate impacts of those risks from an equity and justice perspective, and also in terms of access to the kinds of nature-based solutions that are important for mitigating those kinds of risks. So in the Urban Systems Lab, which is a space I encourage you to check out a little bit more, perhaps after this talk, we are a center that are focused on research and design for really addressing fundamental questions about how to advance climate resilience and also how to advance goals for social justice and environmental justice in our cities. And so we look at a lot of this from an equity perspective. And as similar to the students' thoughts a few minutes ago, I'm also talking to you from the historic and current lands of the Lenape people, which predate all of our colonization and work here as well. And so it's just an important context to keep in mind. What is our real goals for this work in the Urban Systems Lab? Well, it's fundamentally about transitioning and actually fundamentally transforming urban systems to a solution space on the planet where we can be moving towards a good Anthropocene, one that is fundamentally different from the dominant narrative that really drives our future. I don't know if you read sci-fi or if you watch any news that are projecting about what our future looks like, but it's very dominated by this dystopian sort of negative future. And yet the future is not written. And where we are now and what it's going to take to put us on a set of pathways that can really lead us into a good Anthropocene is a fundamental question that we're trying to work on within the Urban Systems Lab. And also to ask this question: how do we build the new urban science that's needed to fundamentally transform for sustainability and resilience on an urban planet? So that's something that we've been working on for some time within the lab and across a network of colleagues that I work really closely with to try to answer this question by actually digging into the trenches of building an interdisciplinary urban science. There's some key aspects where we've done this recently. For example, in 2016, in a relatively highly cited paper, we thought about my own discipline in urban ecology, which is an umbrella of subfields that are increasingly interdisciplinary. And we've asked the question and are trying to answer that question on how do we really shift this field to develop an urban systems science. At a similar time coming out around this is after some advocacy for building an urban science that we did in the run-up to Habitat 3 in Quito in 2016 in a paper that came out in Nature. Following that, the launch of the new Nature journal, Nature Sustainability, convened an international expert panel of urban scholars, including some amazing people like Karen Cito, Sue Parnell, Michele Acuto, Luis Betancourt and Michael Batty, Mark Pelling, et cetera. And together, we put together a report that really tries to lay the framework for why a new urban science policy interface is needed, that of course is going to need to rest on the development of a new interdisciplinary systems-based urban science and what that could look like. This is easy to find if you search for it. I think there's some really interesting points here posted on the Nature site, and I encourage you to take a look at this. At the same time, as this was launched, also we launched a book, a pretty sizable volume, over 100 authors that were describing the state of the urban planet. And we took this position intentionally because of the rapid shift in urbanization that has now made cities a dominant driver of global environmental change on the planet. And this is, I think, is a great resource for students in particular to really think about the diverse perspectives about what it means to be living in the urban century and what are the kinds of challenges that we're facing and solutions that we have at our fingertips from planners' perspectives, economists, designers, artists and scientists and activists alike. This is free and available to download, of course. What has just recently emerged out of the same question for thinking about how do we advance the Sustainable Development Goals, which nearly all of them, and one could argue all of them, rely on Sustainable Development Goal 11, the urban goal, because of the way in which the urban question is so tightly intersected with all other sustainable development questions. And we launched this new journal, Nature partner journal, Urban Sustainability. And for anyone working in this space, I would encourage you to think about submitting here, and certainly to be reading the kinds of submissions that are coming out of this new space that we're trying to create, again, to advance the foundations of a new urban system science that can really underpin the work that we need to do to advance sustainability and resilience on the planet. All of this work is driven by these trends, something that I and others have been calling for a while, the great urban acceleration. And what you're really looking at here, especially if you look on the top row, is since the middle of the last century, this rapid rise of the urban population and the nature of the consumption of urban areas that drives carbon emissions. For example, over 70% of carbon emissions are coming from cities. That's driving temperature change, that's driving natural resource extraction, and driving massive consumption trends on the planet. And so there is a very tight correlation, and one could argue a strong driving signal of the way in which cities currently consume and grow and spread that is fundamental to both the problem of unsustainability on this planet and also the solution space, because cities are also engines of innovation. It's where the most action on climate change is actually happening. So underpinning all of this work and really a rationale for why we need to think about cities in this space as a space of solutions for urban resilience sustainability is really underpinned by these trends. And also thinking about the nature of what cities really are. They're very complicated spaces, right? They're also complex. Some of the work that we've done has really been trying to unpack what complexity means when it comes to trying to understand urban processes and urban patterns, and especially persistent patterns that we want to change, right? These sort of wicked problems that are very difficult to unpack, and understanding the complexity of that is critical. It's also understanding that cities are very different. They're very similar in some ways, but they're also very unique in others. They're very connected spaces internally within themselves, as well as to other urban systems. They can be very congested and even contested spaces. And it's why I've been arguing along with a number of colleagues that fundamentally we need to take a systems perspective to designing solutions and to thinking systemically about how we can deploy solutions that can address these fundamental problems. That's because if you think about that slide right before, we have to think about the nature of food, energy, water systems, critical infrastructure systems, social systems and governance systems, the ecological systems that are in cities, all of which interact in real time daily within our cities to drive the kinds of patterns and processes that we see. And so as Barry Commoner said in 1971, everything is connected to everything else. This may be the rule of ecology in a sense, but it's never been easy to answer questions of how do systems interact. It's always been challenging, and only recently, I think, are we able to start taking the systems perspective in a more holistic sense to really understand the complexity of urban systems. 2 decades of interdisciplinary work in socio-ecological systems work, which is where my background in urban ecology comes out of. Similar time frame for fundamental interdisciplinary advances from systems perspectives and social technical systems work have nonetheless remained somewhat siloed. And so we've been arguing that these need to come together for developing the next generation of urban science. And that the way in which we've been doing this is being picked up by projects and scholars all around the world at this point, is to argue that cities are socio-ecological technological systems, or sets, as we like to call them, and that if you study any problem in an urban system, or if you bring a solution that is only addressing one of these domains, it's not fundamentally going to work, or you won't fundamentally understand the nature of the challenge that you're trying to address, because they're so tightly intertwined. And perhaps not only in urban systems, but in all human dominated systems on the planet, that we need to really be thinking, addressing and developing solutions within the interactive and dynamic space of social, ecological, and technological domains. I would argue that we can now start to do this in a way that we've never been able to do that before, because of the way in which we are now in a big data revolution. I'm sure you're all very familiar with this, but if we just sort of chart the rapid rise of open data and different kinds of data sources and the sort of bigness of them, we have tools at our fingertips now, in some cases only in the last 5 years, that have really allowed us to start to dig into the complexity of urban systems in a way we haven't done before. And hopefully I'll show you a few of those examples over the next few minutes of the talk. One example would be, for example, how we can advance some of the social science types questions that we might have about urban values, urban possessions, urban livelihoods, urban human kinds of dynamics, about how they're using spaces, by asking questions of social media data, which are rapidly becoming more available and allowing us to ask questions we've never been able to ask before. Similarly, we can start to think about the way in which the comfort that everyone seems to have with maps in a way that when I grew up and my generation just didn't have. Google Maps didn't exist then, right? This has allowed us to start to use this as a platform to put together multiple kinds of data to be able to ask these questions about where are the climate risks, where are the nature-based solutions, who has the most need. And these are some aspects I'm going to dig into with you over the next half hour as we sort of look at some of the work that we've been doing in the Urban Systems Lab. All of this, as Linda pointed out in the introduction, is supported by, in most cases, the National Science Foundation, also some European sources. And I only mention this for two reasons. One, to thank the NSF for their support, but also because when the EUR-XSRN, the Urban Resilience to Weather-Related Extremes Network, started in 2015, we started with this conceptual foundation of socio-ecological technological systems. More recently, the Convergence program at the National Science Foundation has allowed us to take this further through the SETS Convergence for Urban Resilience project. And this is also the fundamental foundation for our European-funded Smarter Greener Cities project in Helsinki, Copenhagen, and Stockholm, and the Natura network for nature-based solutions for urban resilience in the Anthropocene. Again, the core conceptual foundation here is to think about what it takes to build a new science. And I say it's new because it's about bringing together disciplines that have been more disparate in the past. And one of the key parts of building any science is to advance the theory as well as to advance the empiricism. And so the SETS conceptual framework is just a core foundation that needs a lot of unpacking, as we've been doing in some other work I won't talk about today, as well as advancing the empiricism from these perspectives, which is what I will focus on for the rest of this. What really launched our project in 2015 and really helped to establish the Urban Systems Lab as well is the recognition that urbanization and climate change are on a collision course. The way in which we develop cities, we concentrate infrastructure, economies, and people in small locations that are often in areas that are prone to weather and climate-related disasters. The rise of that, the rapid explosion of urban areas across the planet, coincident, maybe not coincident, tightly correlated, perhaps driving these very similar rise in climate change and the impacts of climate change really underpin this need to understand how to make cities more resilient, given that this collision course is already happening. In the very bottom image there is an image from Phoenix, Arizona. In 2014, Phoenix had a 500-year flood event, and 3 weeks later was followed by another 100-year flood event. Just 2 weeks ago in New York City, the tropical storm Ida came through. It set records for rainfall in New York, broke all records. The record had just been set 2 weeks earlier by a rainfall event in New York City. And so one of the things that we're seeing is this increasing frequency and intensity of extreme events of all kinds that are having their largest social, economic, and infrastructural impact in cities. If you look at this from a global scale, this is just a record over the last century of recorded natural disaster events. And you can see at least the pattern based on the available data is pretty clear that this isn't just a New York phenomenon or a US phenomenon, but is a global phenomenon. We partner with NASA for the second assessment report on climate change in cities led by Cynthia Rosenzweig and Bill Selecki and others to downscale global climate model projections for 40 cities, large, medium, and small around the world. And one of the things we saw in these gray bars is that there was zero exception for increasing temperature across different climate scenarios. And that says a couple things. One, it's interesting that there's really not a whole lot of variation in the fact that cities are going to get hotter. It seems to be very clear signal that we have here. The other thing that was interesting is that they're getting hotter at about twice the global mean temperature change. So cities are getting hotter much faster than other areas in the region, and certainly compared to a global average. This is of concern for a number of reasons, and which I'll dig into when we talk a little bit more about heat. Some other work, which I'm going to go through kind of quickly because it's still in process, and there may be some minor changes still associated with this, is work that we're doing connected to the IPCC in the latest global climate scenarios, which there's some buzzwords at the top, CMIP 6 being the one that just means this is the latest batch of global climate scenarios. We've been trying to look at what population and infrastructure exposure is likely to be for cities. And in the top, which you probably can't read, is the historical exposure for extreme heat, extreme rainfall, and sea level rise. In the bottom box is what that could look like under a more business as usual case, which some might refer to as a worst case scenario, but is certainly the track that we're on in terms of carbon emissions right now. That is the pathway that we're all trying to shift, both in terms of our lifestyles, politically and otherwise, in order to make sure that this doesn't happen. But what these scenarios are telling us is underline some of the points I've already been making. If you just look at sea level rise and the percentage in the parentheses here, if you look at urban population on the left column, the number of people exposed to sea level rise driven coastal flooding could go up by a factor of 22, means 22 times the historical exposure. That's kind of a worst case scenario, but even in a medium pathway, the cell right next to it, it's still 16 times the number of people that may be exposed. So this is just to give you a sense. I'm not going to get into this work too much today because we'll save this talk for another time, but there are some really deep concerns we have about how climate change is ramping up to cause havoc in cities and what it is that we can do about it. And the question I'm going to focus on today is, who's really going to be most affected? Linda asked me to focus on New York, so there was a little bit of a sort of global context for the work in New York we'll show, but here is an example from New York. I'm sure all of you are aware of Hurricane Sandy and its impacts on New York City. Since 2012, the city has been deeply focused on protecting and preparing for similar kinds of coastal flood events. We've only recently started to think about extreme precipitation events like the ones we just experienced a couple of weeks ago in New York City from Tropical Storm Ida, which also caused devastation, massive loss of life within New York City and New Jersey. And the city is still literally today dealing with the aftermath of that. All the city agencies are 100% focused still on recovering from Ida. These kinds of extreme events last a long time in terms of their impacts. A few years ago, with a postdoc, Yaela DePietri, we put together the most comprehensive database on natural disasters in New York City. This was by combining national and regional databases, and then also doing this very painful work of matching all events with New York Times articles and then extracting out what the social and economic impacts of those events were. One of the things we see is that New York City's faced natural disasters of all kinds. And actually over its entire history, at least in the 140-year history, we were able to reconstruct. Two things fall out here from this figure. One is that urban flooding and extreme heat are the two that seem to be most impactful from a social and economic perspective. However, most of the times when you hear about an extreme event, whether it's Hurricane Ida and what the Governor Hochul just said about it, which was it cost X number of dollars of damage. And when we talk about Hurricane Sandy, we often say, well, it was $19 billion of damage in the region to the city, $16 billion of damage in the region. And yet it's also people's lives that are affected. If you look at this from a human death perspective, what was amazing that really came out of this and corroborates other national and global studies is that extreme heat is the most important direct health impact on people that we have to worry about, at least over the history of extreme events in New York City. And so this is one of the reasons we focused on heat in particular within our work within the lab. Our work has also showed that there is a steady signal of an increase in the number of heat waves events. And this is a concern for us in New York because heat waves are responsible, as it was showing from that historical analysis. And we also know from EPA and other national studies, global studies are showing similar trends that the highest mortality rates from any kind of extreme event come from heat waves. The New York City Panel on Climate Change, which is a body that advises the mayor on climate change in New York, has projected by downscaling global climate models for the region of New York City that heat waves may triple by the 2080s. If you dig into this, it's actually increasing their intensity and frequency. And one of the things that we're already seeing is increasing their duration. So if you think about the way this works on people's actual bodies who are living in 5-story walk-ups or whatever apartment they may be living in New York City, this means that as the heat wave lasts longer and longer, it's harder and harder for people to cool their bodies down, especially if they don't have access to air conditioning. And so now as we're going to get into some of these questions about who really is at risk from the kinds of climate events in New York and other cities are quite similar, because we know that the impacts can be really disproportionate. Here in the dark red, what you're seeing is hotspots for communities in New York that have no access to air conditioning. Air conditioning is one of the main adaptation strategies we have for dealing with heat in the summer and heat waves, and yet not everyone has access to them. Even if you give them access to them, people who are on fixed incomes and are low income or living below the poverty line cannot afford to pay the energy bill to run air conditioning. And so the way in which high heat impacts on the body can easily transition into heat-related hospital visits or mortality. And we see this every single year. There are hundreds and hundreds of heat-related deaths every single year in New York City. And the concern is that these will go up or even spike during more extreme events. This also illustrates the beginning of a story I want to tell you about the disproportionate impacts of climate change events and weather-related events in New York. Why are some people more affected than others? There's a lot of ways to answer this question. One of them is to really try to understand what makes someone vulnerable and what was the history of where they live or the conditions in which they live within the city that are driving that. Here's a list of a number of them, right? Your race and ethnicity can make you more vulnerable for many reasons. One, because you may have other legacies of past racist planning or disinvestment in your neighborhood that have driven health conditions, prior medical conditions, or other ways that make you more vulnerable to extreme heat, and they're correlated with your race and ethnicity for hopefully not a surprising reason there. Whether you're elderly, whether you have access to air conditioning, whether you have the financial means to move to some other location temporarily or find other ways to adapt and cope with high heat. These are all important drivers of what makes an individual or a community vulnerable to heat. We've looked at this in New York City, and one of the things that we found, perhaps not surprisingly, if you know very much about the way the different neighborhoods in New York City, is that it is disproportionate. There are neighborhoods that are at much higher risk of heat because of the way in which they've been made vulnerable by the neighborhoods that they live in and the nature of those neighborhoods being highly paved, not very green, doesn't have access to parks and street trees and things that can cool down that neighborhood. They may be areas that have high concentrations of air pollution, which interacts with heat and creates increased health impacts of heat. There's a whole number of ways in which the system and the history of the way in which the system has been invested or disinvested in that creates the conditions for vulnerability to heat that in the end, it's clear that we need to start calling this what it is. This is an environmental justice issue. This is about the way in which climate change is not equally felt. And it's not simply because climate change happens. It's not simply because the temperatures are getting warmer. It's because the way in which we've developed our city that place some people at more risk than others. And I'll dig into this with just a little bit of detail. On the left, what you see here in dark blue are areas where there are more elderly people in New York. If you're not familiar with New York, in the bottom left is Staten Island. At the very top is the Bronx. On the far left is Manhattan. On the far right is Queens, and below that is Brooklyn. So in the dark, you see elderly population. US Census data has become a powerful tool for us to think about how we can understand the social demographic characteristics of vulnerability to climate events. But we also need to do more work here. And one of the things that we've done is to take some tools from geography and use them as a way to disaggregate that information at high resolution so that we can better pinpoint where exactly should we be investing in solutions to deal with heat. For example, if you look at this zoom in here into Sheepshead Bay, for example, on the right, you can see that we've been able to disaggregate this information to make it spatially very high resolution so that we can overlay where the hottest areas in the city are, where the highest concentrations of the elderly are, down to the buildings that they actually live in. And that's really important for a word I'll use a couple times, which is adaptation prioritization. How can we spatially prioritize our urban planning and our policies and our on the ground investments so that they can have the most impact? And by that, I think the argument will be hopefully clear by the end of this talk that the most impact is going to be about putting those investments in the neighborhoods where people have the most need for those solutions, whether that's air conditioning or tree planting or social network building or many other things that will be important for addressing heat. You're just seeing where the elderly are here, but we can do this for many variables, right? So here on the left is elderly in purple, Black African American populations. You can see the dark green where there's higher concentrations in the city. Those that are living below the poverty level in New York, and the dark areas in orange, and how we can add these up to really develop an index of understanding how to prioritize based on multiple variables of vulnerability, where investments are most needed for dealing with the risks of heat and heat waves in New York. We've been living through the pandemic for 18 months or so. One of the things that we've seen is that people of color, low-income folks in the city are facing multiple kinds of risks. What you see in the left figure here is a plot of the percent of positive COVID cases mapped onto the number or percent of people who don't have health insurance. There are hundreds of thousands of people who don't have health insurance, and that doesn't count the undocumented residents in the city, hundreds of thousands. And in the dark spaces on the right, you can see that I've circled two areas that I want to focus on for a minute. Areas of East Harlem and Northern Manhattan and South and Central Bronx in the upper orange circle, and then parts of Queens that I want to call out in the other orange circle. These are areas of people who not only don't have health insurance, but also have high incidence of COVID cases. These are also neighborhoods that have high concentrations of people of color and Black and brown and Asian communities here. And these are also areas that are low income. So on the left in this figure, you can also see the number of cases that are the highest on the y-axis are also people who are in the lowest income brackets. What I'm really trying to get at here is I was just talking about social vulnerability to heat using the same variables. When we look at vulnerability to COVID, we see the same variables matter. And one of the things that is starting to come out pretty clearly is that, of course, there's variation across a complex city like New York, but there are also very consistent spatial patterns about where people live that face multiple kinds of challenges, not only from climate change, but other kinds of risk like pandemics in this case. And what I would argue this is adding up to is that we have to worry about how bad climate change is going to be and how it will increase the frequency and intensity of storms, increase the frequency and intensity of heat waves. But fundamental to the solution space is understanding the complexity of our social, ecological, and technological infrastructure systems, and then way in which they have over decades and decades built up risk, created risk in particular neighborhoods and not in others. This is an image from the CUNY Center for Urban Questions in the city. And here, the point really is that decades of racist policies and plans, not only through redlining, but many other kinds of things that have happened in New York, have really placed Black and brown and low-income communities in particular in harm's way and in multiple harm's way. Our work on heat really led us to ask this question about the way in which heat and COVID interact, and it's forcing us to ask additional questions. For example, our work on heat and the social vulnerability has really led to the work we did with the Mayor's Urban Heat Island Task Force between 2016 and 2018. And in 2018, the city launched the first major plan to address heat called the Cool Neighborhoods Plan, which is a $100 million initiative to plant trees, build buddy systems and social cohesion, and deploy a whole suite of methods to try to reduce heat risk and heat itself in the city. And I think this is just an important way of thinking about how the urban science that we've been trying to build is starting to have impact on the kinds of plans and solutions that we can deliver. And of course, there's so much more work to do. And additionally, I think $100 million is a really great start, but there's going to be much more that's really needed to address this in New York City. And there's reasons for this, not only because of the climate projections, but the New York City Panel on Climate Change in their last assessment report, we're busy working on the next assessment report right now, went so far not only project future temperature change in the city, in the region, but also the potential additional deaths from heat waves that could happen. So if we do our job right, if we can build the knowledge and we can work on the policy and planning aspects to really build the solutions into this, these kinds of events that are projected are exactly the kind of events that we should be able to prevent. And I hope that we can make the right kind of progress to do that. And that's what our lab is trying to do in every way. We've gone a little bit further with our work. We've also developed new methods to be able to go from a large regional projection that says, under this scenario, it's going to increase 1.5 degrees Celsius. Under another projection or scenario, it's going to increase 3 degrees Celsius. What we really need to know is where to invest limited amounts of funds to have the most impact for reducing heat and heat risk in the city. We've been able to develop methods to spatially project. Of course, there's uncertainty in any projection, but to project where in the city we'll see the most heat increases, because it's not as if you add 2 degrees to an urban system, every part of the system just goes up by 2 degrees, right? The nature and the way we built cities to trap heat mean that they're different in different locations, and the way in which temperature will change those locations as it goes up has everything to do with the built form and the architecture and the landscape and land cover and land uses that the city has. And if you bring all of those information together, you can start to get a much more granular look at what future temperature impacts may be in the city. If you look at the 2050s projection here in the middle, you can see that, again, just from a heat perspective, the surface temperature projected here is spatially variable, meaning some areas are going to get much hotter than others as we move from the present to a couple decades out. The other thing that stands out from this analysis, and this is also work in progress, is that as we move farther out, the temperature increases that are projected depending on the scenario that you actually look at for global climate change means that eventually the city is just going to be hot all over. And some of these temperatures are pretty scary because these are not heat wave maps. These are just average summer days. And the dark reds here are 37 to 40, 43, or in the far right, 46 degrees Celsius. If you do a translation in your head, which I can't do, that's over 100 degrees on an average summer day for a number of parts of the city in just a few decades. So we have some serious work to do. And one of the reasons I put these, I talk about this with my classes and my students too, is not because we should be scared, but because we should have our eyes open about the seriousness of the challenge and the level of transformation that's going to be needed to really transform our cities to be able to be resilient to these kinds of challenges. And there are solutions that we can take. I'm going to move through the rest of this heat work quick to talk a little bit more about flooding, but I want to mention that Luis Ortiz, a postdoc in our lab, is doing some really interesting work to not only look at outdoor heat exposure, but indoor heat exposure and trying to understand what that might be for different areas of the city. And similar patterns come out that indoor exposure is going to have everything to do with the kind of building you live in, the kind of insulation it has, also the way in which that outdoor temperature will translate infrared energy into the building and what that exposure might look like. People spend a lot of their time indoors, so understanding both the indoor and outdoor exposure and how to develop solutions that can address both of those is going to be critical to solving the heat challenge. Additionally, and this gets to this question about who's going to be most affected, when we think about air conditioning as one of the most effective short-term solutions for providing cooling during hot summer days, we see that the AC adoption is growing in New York. In fact, New York City gave out over 70,000 air conditioners last year. First time it's ever done this for low-income residents after a decade of community groups and activists trying to convince the city that they have to subsidize air conditioning. And they're finally able to do it, to cut through the red tape, to not only buy air conditioners, but to pay the bills for those air conditioners. And that's a game changer for people. It's really important. But when you look out and we start to think about what a wider AC adoption, so we could think about this from an equity perspective. What if everyone had AC? Well, that would be pretty wonderful if you're not thinking about the energy sources that might be powering those and the way in which, if they're not 100% renewable, might be delivering more carbon emissions than we really want to account for. But let's just say everyone had those. Is that, again, mean that the equity problem here is solved? Not really. And that's what these maps, which are a little complicated, but are trying to show, is that actually the cost of AC are going to go up. And they're going to go up because if you know how an air conditioner works, it's essentially working with temperature differentials between the inside and the outside of the building. As the outside temperature goes up, the air conditioner has to work much harder to pull hot air from the outside to dump it to what should be a cooler space outside. Hot air from the inside needs to be dumped outside. If that outside temperature is higher, then it has to work harder, which means it needs more energy and it's going to cost more to run. If we think about this from income perspective, that means that the cost of running your air conditioner is going to go up and not everyone is going to be able to handle that equally. So there's a lot of just fundamental questions, and I'm putting this in specifically to think about energy and infrastructure in the context of social vulnerability and disproportionate impacts of climate change to really drive home the fact that there are complex issues that we really have to understand much more fully to think about what the solutions look like, and not to say we shouldn't provide air conditioning for short-term solutions, but we have to be thinking about how we subsidize that, or we build better insulation into the housing so that they don't have to be run as often, and how we develop, for example, street trees and other kinds of green roofs and nature-based solutions outside to decrease the local neighborhood temperatures also, which will help increase the efficiency of AC. So just to kind of dig in a little deep on that with a bit of complexity. It's not just about heat, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the water issues and then we'll head towards sort of wrapping up a few points here. We've been looking at the similar questions when it comes to coastal flood risk. Ever since Hurricane Sandy, the city has been making massive investments in coastal protection and preparedness to deal with the kinds of storm surge and devastation that wrecked so many parts of New York City when Hurricane Sandy hit. We've recently done some, I think, pretty straightforward kinds of mapping, but what comes out of this are some really important questions. And here to try to understand what happens when the floodplain changes. One of the things we learned during Hurricane Sandy is that the FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency of the federal government, the floodplains that they have that really drive our understanding of where likelihood of coastal flooding is all across the nation were completely inaccurate. Sandy inundation just didn't match the floodplains. So FEMA's been in a process of redoing our floodplain maps, which will impact the National Flood Insurance Program. It'll impact who's required to have insurance. It'll impact real estate. It's going to be pretty massive. They're probably going to come out in a year or two. We did a study to look at what the impact of changing that floodplain might be. And one of the things that we found is that a number of people are already living in that floodplain. In fact, a very high number of people. New York State has a designation, this is statewide, not just for New York City, called potential environmental justice areas. When we overlaid here in orange, the potential environmental justice areas of New York City with the current and potential future floodplain map, one of the things we found was not just a lot of people live near the coastline in New York, we all know that, but that actually 800,000 people who live in potential environmental justice areas also live below the 100-year floodplain, which means we have a very large number of people already from a very similar perspective as we were talking about heat, that are socially vulnerable for multiple reasons to coastal flooding because of where they live and history and legacies of their neighborhoods, that are in harm's way when it comes to a potential event like Sandy coming back again to New York City. This is some recent work, which I'd encourage you to check out if you're interested in these issues, led by some of the students and postdocs in my lab. If we think about extreme rainfall, well, that's a much newer issue for the city to seriously tackle. Hurricane Harvey, if you remember when it hit Houston a few years ago now, was a bit of a wake-up call for New York, because we're watching the devastation in Houston, 3 feet of water on the ground right in the middle of the city in some areas. And the city, sort of instantly thought, well, we got to make sure that doesn't happen here. What can we do about it? Hurricane Sandy was devastating, but it was driven by coastal storm surge. What about extreme rainfall? We haven't seriously tackled that in New York until very recently. So in 2018, the city launched what's called the New York City Stormwater Resiliency Study. It's a study that I co-led with colleagues at CUNY Brooklyn College, Stevens Institute, consulting firm Jupiter Intelligence, and some others, to try to help the city understand what is the range of the possible flood event magnitudes from extreme precipitation, as well as extreme precipitation and or coastal surge. What are the human and critical infrastructures that are going to be most at risk during those kinds of events that we may face in the future? And what are the interventions that are going to be best suited to mitigate those risks? The first phase of this study was completed in 2022. But this work is still ongoing, as you might imagine, because there's a lot that goes into trying to answer these questions to help the city with this. But one of the key things we did with our partners was a whole series of analyses to understand the range of extreme events that we need to understand. What's happened in the past 100 years, for example, in New York, conducting rain modeling, and then developing a set of scenarios that go from chronic rain events to extreme, very rare 100 or 1,000-year flood events, to compound events, ones where we see both extreme rainfall and storm surge that may also be driven in the future by increasing sea level rise, that together create very unique and very powerful storm events that the city needs to figure out how to be prepared for. When you put these together, it can be very complex, but this goes back to one of my early points. The computational ability we have, the complexity of the models that we have, and the increasing availability of big data of all types has allowed us to start to get a much more nuanced answer to these kinds of questions than we've ever been able to ask. It may be that the political will to ask questions and to develop and put real funds into understanding extreme precipitation for New York was one of the reasons why we haven't done this sooner. It may also be that we're only just now have the tools to be able to actually answer these questions. And I think New York City has perhaps invested more than any other in this so far. I mean, this study is over a $2 million study, and it's just getting started. But I want to show you a little bit of the results from this. Here's an early draft. This isn't a final version of what this looks like, but essentially, like heat, we can simulate scenarios at very high resolution now where you can zoom into a neighborhood or a street or a building and ask, okay, if it rains 3 inches over a 4-hour period, is this street or this sidewalk likely to flood? How much for how long? What's the depth? What's the flow rate? When will it recede? These are the kinds of questions we need to know so that we can figure out where we have to prioritize interventions to deal with flooding. It also means digging into some of the questions we ask about heat, digging into the neighborhood level, where, for example, we ask questions about what are the critical infrastructures that might be there: hospitals, police stations, fire stations, places that are critical for emergency response and provide critical services. And then also, what are the characteristics of neighborhoods that we need to know about that might be neighborhoods that are socially vulnerable because of low income, or because of other things that are bound up with race and ethnicity, or because of the nature of the infrastructure in their city. Just 2 quick examples on this. In the dark red are some examples of critical services, where certain parts of the city have more power plants, more hospitals, more fire stations, more homeless shelters than others. And these are ones we want to make sure that we take a close look at if we're thinking about where flooding might occur. Or similar to the work we've done on heat and coastal flooding, is to ask questions about where neighborhoods that may be low income and have less access to resources, or even less car ownership, where they're able to move around during an extreme rainfall event, or get out of harm's way, that they may be, from a mobility perspective, more stuck than others. And these are the kinds of things that have all gone into what was just launched in May this year, and was built on the study that we've done here, the first of its kind New York City Stormwater Resiliency Plan, that lays out a whole suite of plans to try to address the risks that would come from both extreme precipitation and compound events from precipitation and storm surge. So we're really excited to have our work starting to develop the knowledge that can inform this kind of planning work. But of course, there's much to do. To seriously address this problem is likely going to cost hundreds of billions of dollars and take decades to implement, because what we're really talking about is making New York City safe for water to flow through it, to absorb as much of it as possible, to get it off the streets and out of the basements that were so devastating during the storm Ida that just happened a couple of weeks ago. But what I want to show you, and this will be sort of the last points I'll make on this, and then we'll finish up, is that doing the basic science, doing these kinds of analyses is fundamental information, and fundamental to really informing the decision-making that the city needs to do to prioritize this, to develop plans. But it's also to develop the tools that can enable that. So you're welcome to navigate to this now or later. This is stormwater.nyc. This is a platform that, when the city released the first stormwater scenario maps that are just released together with that plan in May, we made available this on a public repository that allows us to ask questions about where flooding is likely to occur. Here in blue, for example, is areas of the city in New York. We'll zoom into parts of Brooklyn here. And you can see here in the dark blue areas that are projected under this particular storm scenario to flood. What we can also do in this, if we zoom out a little bit, is we can look at where some of these critical facilities are. Where are the hospitals that are going to need to have better protection? For example, right here, if the adjacent street is going to be flooded to an extent that may inhibit ambulance movement or other kinds of transportation. Where are the fire stations that may need to eventually be moved, especially in more severe events, if they're going to be able to function adequately as an emergency response hub in the city? You can do the same thing by looking at where the elderly populations live, for example, and trying to understand where are we going to have more services, because there's a high concentration of elderly people who may be less able to respond during a flood event if they're trying to move around or gain access to food, water, energy, communication during any kind of associated power outage that might also be affected by flooding on their street. So it's just to say that our work has been to not only try to advance the science, but to think about the ways in which we can develop decision support tools and communicate that more broadly to really improve decision-making and planning. And I want to also mention that what I'm trying to build up to it as an argument is that we live in a multi-hazard world. The nature of the hazards that we're going to face will similarly be that way in the future, it seems, and maybe even potentially worse. And the impacts of these hazards are disproportionate. They affect low income and communities of color much more than anyone else for lots of reasons, reasons that we can talk about more in questions if I haven't got into them enough today. But we also need to understand how to develop solutions that can target a multi-hazard world. What I mean is, if we can start to develop the tools where on the right, for example, at very high resolution, we can start to prioritize adaptation in the areas where they're most needed, to think about that in the ways people are affected by flooding, by heat, by COVID, by a number of things that may be affecting them in their neighborhoods, that we can start to think about deploying solutions that can have maximum effectiveness. And also from a planning perspective, to really use the sort of dominant planning paradigm of spatial prioritization as a way to allocate investments, hopefully for as much impact as possible. We're trying to communicate these things not only for city decision makers, but also to educate younger generation, to provide tools for community workshops and other tools. Something you could keep your eye on is our Climate Equity XR app, which is both an augmented and virtual reality experience that layers in the kind of information that I've been showing you, as well various kinds of nature-based solutions, where the street trees are, where the city's invested 10,000 bioswales and green roofs, and rain gardens as a way to deal with stormwater. So we can start to really understand whether or not your neighborhood, from a mobile first-person perspective, is getting the investments that it needs, and how to understand that more. We hope to have this out by the end of the year. I know I'm running up on time, Linda, so I'm going to finish up kind of fast on this point. But the main thing I want to say about the role of nature-based solutions, which could be its own presentation, of course, on its own, is that they're deeply multifunctional. Trees, green roofs, parks, gardens, urban farms, a whole suite of green spaces in New York can provide multiple kinds of benefits. And it's why cities all around the world are investing more and more in what we might call nature-based infrastructure or nature-based solutions. In fact, the UN Convention on Biological Diversity at the last COP24, the next one is coming up actually virtually in a couple of weeks, said that at a global scale, 30% of the climate solution can be solved by nature-based solutions. We see this is true in cities as well. And some of the work we've done in New York has been to really try to map what are the cooling benefits, the stormwater absorption benefits, the carbon storage and air pollution removal benefits, the recreation benefits of green space in New York, and where should we be investing more because they're not providing the benefit that they could? Where do we need restoration, better conservation and expansion in particular neighborhoods? And where are they actually doing really well? And we need to call attention to that and support them. This is some early work. We've advanced this work to ask questions similar to what we've done with heat and flood risk, which is to say, what are the communities in the middle in the red that have the most need for these kinds of nature-based solutions? Where, similar to the slide right before on the left under supply, is temperature regulation or cooling being supplied? Is stormwater absorption being supplied? And where's the mismatch in the far right, where these two don't align, where essentially you have neighborhoods that have high demand, high need based on these social vulnerability indicators for heat or for flooding or similar kinds of indicators. They have this high need for the solutions that nature can provide, but they don't have the supply of them because there isn't good street tree stock in the neighborhood. They don't have access to large or high quality parks or other kinds of forested or wetland areas, for example. And what you're able to do with this is from a different perspective here of trying to understand where do we need to prioritize nature-based solutions. Again, coming with a spatial prioritization approach to really see in the red, these are the hotspots for high demand and low supply. And the spatial mismatch approach here allows us to really start to pinpoint where not only high temperatures might be, but where the solutions may not be available and how we can start to think about investing in nature-based solutions in the locations where they're most at need. This also means thinking about, and I'm wrapping up here to go back to the conceptual framing I started with, the way in which we should have to think about all our solutions from a social, ecological, and technological perspective. For example, if you think about putting in an urban garden or planting trees on a street, who's going to take care of them? Are those trees going to be pruned? Who's going to water them during drought? What are the social management aspects, stewardship aspects that have to be part of that if you want that nature-based solution to actually be a solution, to perform at the level that we need it to be? From an ecological perspective, we have to think about, are they resilient to changing weather and climate in the city? And how do we ensure that they are? Are they ecologically functioning? Are they ecologically healthy? What are the ways in which that needs to be supported? From a technological perspective, you can think about green roofs and the fact that because they can hold so much water and the soils are very heavy, that the buildings have to be structurally supportive and for us to be able to deploy more green roofs in the city. How do we invest in the technology, the fundamental infrastructure, and even the technology to monitor and evaluate performance of nature-based solutions? How can we be sure that they are performing at the level that we say they are? A lot of the work I showed you before is model-driven. We need real-time technology invested in the bioswales and green roofs and on trees in the cities so that we can really understand how they are performing to deliver the solutions that we're asking them to deliver for us. This is some work that a colleague of mine, Brenda Lynn, and others led that makes these points, that in some areas of the city, we're going to need to invest heavily in the social aspects, and other the social ecological aspects, and others the technological aspects, and in many cases, all three, to really think about the suite of solutions and how they come together to really advance climate adaptation and climate resilience in the city. And if you want to dig into this any deeper, this would just be one suggestion. This is a study that didn't just do some kind of meta-analysis. This was, we literally read over 600 papers on the topic. And I find the paper interesting, but the supplemental document, which is extremely long, provides really, I think, a great starting point for understanding the socio-ecological and technological factors that are important to understand both what nature can do and how we're going to have to invest in those aspects more in order for it to really deliver the kinds of solutions that we're asking of it in cities. So finally, coming back to a bit where we started, the systems perspective, I think, is critical to think about the complexity of systems. How can we harness this complexity as a way to push ourselves from the left side of this figure in the present along a pathway that can be much more transformative, fundamentally address and redress legacies of disinvestment and racist policies that have put certain people and not others in harm's way from a multi-hazard perspective. How do we start to redress and address that in a way that can deliver cities that aren't this dystopian future that we see in most of the sci-fi novels and movies, but are actually ones that are livable, more sustainable, and more resilient? And so I'll leave it there and just say, if you want to dig in a little bit more of how we've been working with communities to do this, chapters that explain how did we actually build the USL Data Viz platform, et cetera. We're launching a new book on this next week, and I invite you to join the conversation there as well. And so I'll just say thank you to a number of folks within the Urban Systems Lab who contributed to this and our funders, and I'm leaving out dozens and dozens of collaborators outside our lab who also deserve to be thanked. So thanks for your attention. I know I put a lot out there for you, and I hope some of this will generate some good questions. And thanks again, Linda, for having me.
Thank you so much, Timon. I apologize for pronouncing your name incorrectly. It's the first time that it's said out loud. What an impressive body of work you have shared with us. The fact that any one individual human being can do so much and study so much and so widely, and this is really just a fraction of his work because he also works internationally, is really impressive. And I hope that all of you are energized and motivated to work on these issues and inspired. I still wish you were here in person so that we could keep talking.
Me too. Me too.
And so this is a research seminar, so it's a bit more on the research end than our normal colloquium, which is more practitioner-based. So I'm going to open with a question that I'm really still thinking through my thoughts and so I'm going to try to think about that. And all of you, please think about your questions. The way this is going to work is the same as previous lecture. You come down and you speak in front of that machine and you'll be able to see you and hear your questions. Okay? So those of you who are thinking about questions, just begin to migrate down. I think it's so interesting that the SETS framework brings together, I don't know which way to stand to like properly.
I can see you either way. So
okay. So the SETS work brings together SES and STS. And then you're applying this to the concerns of environmental justice communities in a place like New York. And I think the struggle that I've always had with SES, STS, and environmental justice is bring the justice and the power elements into the SES and STS literatures, which really study it methodologically, epistemologically, from a way of measuring and understanding the world in the way that you have. And it's quite different from the ways in which we think about environmental justice, politics, racism that contribute and cause the conditions that we see now. And so I'm curious about how they meld back together because you are bringing these tools of SES and STS to look at these issues of inequality. So in that sense, they're coming together. But in terms of where these tools take us in the solution space, I'm wondering how to think about that because the tools are so powerful. If I were mayor, I would be so excited, and the mayor de Blasio is so excited by this kind of work because they precisely tell you where, if you look at this elderly house, you could do this kind of infrastructure and you can address its vulnerability. At the same time, some of the things, including one of the early maps you showed, of the use of social media. It's like, where's crime? Or where's poverty? Where's this and that? These tools are also actually used by these entrenched political, racial, social systems to be used for community surveillance and policing and other things, or for speculative investment and land purchases, et cetera, et cetera. And the places that you identify as being most at risk, we probably could have known those, like the Bronx, Harlem, Queens, those same places you would have known for decades now as being the places that have lacked all sorts of environmental amenities, of street trees that have high pollution rates, that have high poverty rates. And so the problem, is the problem the lack of data, or is the problem something else? To what extent does data solve the problem? And should the problem be solved with the street trees, or does the street tree solve it? Or is it changing the labor structure or something else that would also fundamentally allow people to buy air conditioning, energy, insurance, etc. So I'm kind of struggling with all these thoughts, and I don't have an exact question, but I'd love to hear your comments.
Really excellent points, Linda. And I absolutely agree. You know, having more data doesn't solve problems on its own. I also think that, you know, some things that we didn't talk about some of the work we've been engaging in around environmental justice is much on the process and recognition side, right? Really, all I've done today is discuss the way in which the spatial distribution of risk, the spatial distribution of certain amenities or lack of amenities is really contributing to that, which is important information because actually, maybe not all cities are like this, but New York City is a very data-driven kind of decision-making place. And so to mobilize political action, policy action, they're very, and this isn't necessarily the best way to do this, right? But they're very focused on what does the data say? And so providing information is a way to really mobilize them within a space. On the other hand, when we think about various solutions that have been used in the past, including Street Trees to the Million Trees tree planting program that was launched in 2008 and planted 1 million trees in New York City. Some communities cut the trees down when they were planted. You know, some of the things that some of my colleagues documented was the way in which communities did not want trees being planted in their neighborhood, regardless of what benefit that they might have. For multiple reasons. One, because they weren't consulted ahead of time. They weren't part of the process. They saw this as a very top-down movement that simply because of the lack of engagement was unwelcome. But also because there was a lot of complexities that didn't get thought through, such as when you plant, when you have trees in front of your brownstone or apartment building, they're often a place that collect trash. That means the rats come there. You know, it's a place where other people will throw things. And then all of a sudden you have an environmental disamenity, not an environmental amenity. And these are things that the community could have told you, but no one asked them. So on the really sort of the engagement and what does procedural equity look like? How do we really advance procedural justice in a way where communities are making their own decisions about the solutions that they want? I think this is a fundamental challenge that the city's aware of, but doesn't quite know how to tackle. It's difficult, and New York City is large and complex. And there's, you know, every community is a little bit different. In some places, you need to talk to people in the barbershops. In other places, it's in the church or the mosque. In other places, it's at the coffee shop. Where do you gauge? I think it's hard as a city government to do that. But from a research perspective, we absolutely have to be elevating these messages. One of the studies I didn't discuss is a study of green infrastructure planning across the US. We think it's the most comprehensive study of US green infrastructure planning to date. We examine and code 122 plans across the US. This has just recently been submitted. And one of the things that we find is that there's a lot of rhetoric around equity and justice, but it's not even defined in city planning. And then we also see that on the procedural side, there's very little acknowledgement even, or serious articulation of how to engage with communities in the plans that are being made right now, where green infrastructure is being used as a tool to address stormwater flooding or other kinds of challenges. So I think one of the points you made is spot on, and I didn't get a chance to talk about it because I agree with it, which is that the way in which any decision about what a solution needs to be made, if it's top down, may just be wrong because of it's top down. It could also be wrong because it doesn't those kinds of decisions just don't understand the nuances of what really drive vulnerability or risk in a neighborhood. And the other is that the engagement with communities as a way of changing the decision-making process to one that is bottom up is fundamentally needed. And we see some great traction with this with like participatory budgeting, for example. It's very small in New York, it's larger in some other cities, but we've seen some successes in that. You know, how can we expand that and use that, for example, as a model, not for everything, but for certain ways in which the participatory aspect is really community driven and community led. The other thing I heard you say though, and I think is incredibly important and is also one of these difficult ways to figure out how it would work, is how you solve problems of job security, energy security, housing security, climate security simultaneously. And to me, that's something that when you start to mix things like the SETS framework with food, energy, water nexus frameworks, and then you try to bring this and understand what is the environmental justice literature saying, the whole bundle of that together suggests that we do need to somehow figure out how to do those things simultaneously. For example, there's concerns about green gentrification through the way in which cities are greening all across the US and around the world. But would that really be a problem if we were not only trying to green a neighborhood to make it cooler, but investing in low-income housing, subsidizing housing so people are not displaced? If there's any associated real estate boon that goes along with that, how do you bundle these things together? And that's a challenge that I don't have the perfect solution to. I wish I did, but I do think is fundamental to address and elevate and really make extremely clear, because there's got to be ways that we can, from a policy and planning perspective, bundle solutions so that one solution doesn't cause another problem. And also to be engaging with communities in a way that they can articulate how to do that and what those actual bundles should be.
Thanks so much. All right, questions? All right, reliably, we have a question here from Anthony. All right, go ahead and step right here.
Thanks. Thank you for speaking today. It was interesting to hear your perspective, both as an academic in the urban planning context and as an advisor to the government of New York. Especially, I was interested in how you talked about how these technological, ecological, and social systems interact, and this sort of focus on the local affairs. One thing though I noticed is that one thing I noticed though was that it seems like you worked a lot with the mayor's office, but I didn't hear you say anything about working with the legislature of New York or with any of the local borough or sub-borough governments. And it kind of seems like to get some of these policies enacted that you're trying to do, you're going to have to work through that. So I guess in your body of research and in trying to develop solutions for these issues, did you explore working within the legislative organs of New York City and with local communities outside of this highly centralized top-down office of the mayor? And sort of like, how is that different from working from the perspective of the chief executive?
Great question. Thanks for that. The short answer is a little bit. And what I mean is an interesting place to find ourselves, because I didn't talk about a lot of the community engagement work that we're doing and the sort of positive visioning work we're doing with communities in New York, but also in other cities, and to find ourselves from as a researcher becoming a broker between groups that may or may not know how to talk to each other. Meaning, for example, community organizations and activists who have clear ideas about what the problems and how to solve them are in their neighborhood, and a similar set of problem identification and solution identification within city agencies. So that's just an interesting space to find ourselves in. And we've certainly recognized that there are other bodies that we're going to have to work through if we want to be also agents of change and not only agents of knowledge production. Which is what we're trying to do, but I think that is a difficult space to be in, and we should all just sort of recognize that. One maybe success of some of this work, which is an example of it, is the work we've done in partnership with the Nature Conservancy office in New York to advocate and for the investment in green roofs in particular as part of the Climate Mobilization Act. That is legislature that was just passed a year and a half ago. And then we've also been working in partnership with our other partners there, Nature Conservancy in particular, leading out some of that, which includes testifying at hearings with the city council, that includes providing fact sheets, that includes post legislation, actually working with the relevant city agencies that are defining the rules that in the legislation are actually vague, but actually have to be, developed into specific action items where you can make decisions on how you might invest, where the money's going to be invested, who's going to benefit from it, what are the ways in which they're going to evaluate, whether it's performing. All of those actually aren't in the legislation and have to be after the fact built out. And so we've supported advising that. But I think your point's well taken, that if you want to have action, there's multiple points of intersection. And I think it's safe to say no one can be everywhere, but we have to think about where to leverage those points of leverage as much as possible, and then prioritize to some extent based on that. But we've been working, I would say, more so than at these legislative moments or spaces of opportunity, and more sort of between the community groups themselves and city agencies. That's just been the kind of the nature of our work to date.
All right, thank you.
Hey, that was kind of funny. Yeah, I was just thinking, there's an awfully lot of climate controlled office towers and places like universities that I think we saw, society doesn't exactly need to occupy, or like people don't need to occupy for society to function in, event of emergency. What do you think the sort of, how could you go about like thinking of reuse and adaptation, leveraging those sorts of assets, just from a research perspective and like a political perspective? Do you envision a sort of future where the way we sort of use the city is just completely different? If it's 110 out and with a heat index of 140.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think a lot of people are trying to grapple with this, right? Universities, businesses, especially as in New York, and you can see this on the front page of the New York Times today, what the fallout of businesses not moving back into office space and the amount of vacant office space that we currently have. And there's the question on everyone's mind is, is this here to stay? And if so, and I think you have a great question there, how is that an opportunity? The first, sort of response is, oh, there's all this economic lack of revenue, the way in which the city has lost X number of dollars from tourism or X number of dollars from tax revenue, the way in which landlords have lost, massive amounts of money from rental income. And yet we have 1 million buildings in New York, and what percentage of them may not go to the same level of occupancy, and how I may be able to rethink those for different kinds of uses. A number of folks who've been homeless during heat waves, and others by the city have been put up in hotels, expensive hotels. I'm just thinking of how we might be able to retrofit commercial spaces and make them low-income residential spaces. They're already built. But this isn't something I've given a lot of serious thought to, and I think this would be a really great question for you and your classmates to really kind of innovate on, is how can we rethink the way in which we use the city if we don't need to use the same amount of square footage for the kinds of uses that we've had before. But nonetheless, the city is growing and is projected to grow. And we have no shortage of lack of low-income housing in New York in every single neighborhood that needs to be addressed. And building small new places here and there isn't solving the problem, right? The problem just is keeping pace with any solution at this point. So we need to be thinking much more out of the box. And I think it's a great opportunity to rethink what the built envelope of the city can do when it's reimagined, especially in a hopefully post-COVID context.
I'll just add to that because Bob Boulder talked to me about this when I saw him in New York. And that after 9/11, a lot of the Wall Street properties began to be the similar issue of becoming vacant, in part because the federal government said you can no longer they no longer wanted to house all of the economic financial services in one place and be so vulnerable to such an attack that made the entire federal system of banking inaccessible for some period of time. And so Wall Street began to move out to places like Brooklyn, and these buildings became vacant. The Wall Street footprints, some of them are smaller, which led them to become renovated, or what is it, WeWork or something like that, those kinds of spaces. But large office buildings, if that's what you're thinking, the floor plates are interior spaces that have no windows, like the World Trade Center was bigger in size. And the building codes, for instance, require that every bedroom has a window to the outside. So for the designers, like it's not just let's like, what is it, Anani going to say, like take over the funny hotels. It's not just that, but it's also there's like design and other issues. Okay.
And then you just speak. Okay. This is so weird.
It
Hi.
is. Hi.
Are you Timon or you're Timon?
Timon.
Right?
Timon.
Timon. Sorry, Timon. So my name is Nima Kudva and I teach here, and like Linda, I think your presentation was fantastic. Thank you. I cannot imagine how you get all that work done. And that is another sort of a conversation, but it's just really quite stunning. And thank you too for acknowledging that the work is, it's a body of work built by so many people, right? And the aspects of collaboration in it. I think it's so important when theorists and practitioners of academic work like yourself actually talk about that. And it doesn't just become you, but the acknowledgement, I think, of an entire body of sort of folks contributing to the work that you're doing. So thank you for that. So Timon, I'm actually sort of going to ask one, I think, like Linda, there's 500 things going on in my head, but it's a little bit of a meta question, right? The classic dilemma for us in policymaking is whether we go towards a spatial solution or an agentic solution, right? We tie the solution to people. And the interesting thing for me, when you're talking about spatial adaptation and really targeting space, is you're kind of fixing space in a way in which it's not fixed in terms of our lived and our experienced manner of it. And so I'm really curious about that, so when we make a model, we're making it based on a history and a certain set of trends and on certain kinds of predictions about the future. But cities don't remain static while our policy making is happening. And so one can completely expect that you've put out your model and that smart developer in Brooklyn has already started buying up spaces. We know from gentrification studies that anticipatory gentrification is a big piece of how development happens. And so, I'm looking at your stuff and I'm thinking, if I had money, I would be, and we know that's already happening actually, right? People are buying up space and getting ready for what is going to be coming. And so what I'm very curious is, from someone who's doing this kind of big data stuff, is what kind of agent-based modeling are you really starting, right? In this whole world of science that is being constructed, are we going into a different modeling system? Every time I hear people talk about big data, it's only about the size of the data that you're dealing with. You're not actually changing really interesting ways of thinking about this dilemma we have of taking one variable as fixed. And in your case, it's space, right? And so I'm kind of, not completely, but kind of.
I'll explain, yeah, but go ahead.
Yeah, explain. I would love to hear more. So it's a very big question and maybe, but you are at the cutting edge in this. And so really explaining, I think, to all of us and to all our students here about how one starts to cut through that central kind of binary dilemma that we've put ourselves in, right? Where our policies are never quite doing the right thing because we're ignoring one or the other.
It's great. I'm so glad you dug into this, and I wish I had another hour. So I didn't show anything actually that's really dynamic in terms of being able to dynamically change a number of parameters in a model and try to understand how that might shift heat risk or something else. However, some of the work that we've been doing, a number of papers in development and some on the ground projects we have right now are doing that. And it's from a modeling perspective, right? There's the sort of traditional agent-based approaches that you can use, but there's also the evolution of new kinds of modeling frameworks, which are just starting to come online, which are really challenging computationally, but we're getting there, and challenging to figure out how one speaks to the other. So I'll just give you a quick example. We've been doing work in 10 US and Latin American cities, for example, to work with a diverse group of stakeholders to articulate their own visions of what resilient, desirable, positive futures look like. In some cases, that's about affordable housing and job security. In other cases, that's about coastal retreat, but doing it in a way that people are involved and have a say in the process. In other cases, these people will come up with amazing ideas about how to change transport and mobility and how to green the city in a number of different ways. We've done this work in San Juan, Puerto Rico, for example, both pre and post Maria. I bring it up because one of the modeling tasks we gave ourselves was to see if we could model those futures to come up with a way to quantify that future and be able to ask how these different visions, because you get 30 people in a room and you come up with 30 visions. We try to get them to come up with 5 or 6, not that everyone has to agree, but that then you can compare and contrast. What does a sort of a mobility, energy security driven future narrative look like, and how might that compare from a coastal retreat, flood resiliency future, and how might that compare to a food security, high investment in urban and peri-urban agriculture scenario, and how can you compare these? And you can do that quantitatively. But quantitatively allows us to really think about where strategies can be synergistic and where the trade-offs are. And I know that's a long background to say that integrating models where you can dynamically changing populations, changing land uses, changing land covers, changing social demographics, and then be able to ask similar kinds of questions from all of those changes happening. That is what we're trying to build. But that means having hydrological models, urban heat island models, land use land cover models, social demographic models, all talking to each other. So I wouldn't say we're there. I would say we're maybe 2/3 of the way there. And hopefully we'll be farther along that in another year or two to really building an integrated urban system model that is very spatial. But it's not because it fixes space, it's because it uses space and tries to then be able to use the dynamic changes and see how when you start to change multiple variables simultaneously, everything interacts. And what we're using for that is models that are called cellular automata models, which are like spatial models in that every cell is spatial in nature and you can assign attributes to it, but it affects every cell around it. And those affect cells around that. And so every single change you have permeates through the entire system across every single layer, which is why they're so computationally intensive. What we're doing now is to actually add agent-based models on top of the cellular automata models. So you can also drive decision-making, governance changes, et cetera, that would then drive the dynamics that might change. Is this development happening or not? Is this land cover changing or not? Has the social demographics changed over what time period? And then how can you work that out over a year or 2 or 20 years or 30 years in the future? And additionally, going back to that work we've done in San Juan and Baltimore and New York and other places, how do those visions that people articulate become rules in the model so we can actually customize that to both articulate business as usual scenarios and how various changes might affect those, as well as these alternative, desirable, positive futures that people have of their own narratives, their own way of articulating the future that they want. And that's kind of long, but that's the short version.
Yeah, no,
of how we're thinking about it.
Yeah, Timon, just a second. Can I have a follow-up question, Linda? May I? Does anybody else have anything?
You grade half the people, so yes.
No, but they can say no. Okay. A lot of the folks here are in a class that I run them. So that's why Linda's saying that. So here's a little bit of a follow-up. So yeah, it's really interesting, right? So I've been looking at the CA and the agent-based modeling stuff, and okay, so fascinating. what happens to the parts of the world where we know urbanization is occurring at the fastest rates and growth is happening at the fastest rates, and there is none of this data that is even collected. I work in small places, and a lot of my students do as well. And when they go out doing a dissertation in 6 years after getting some amount of funding, all they do is collect enough data to be able to describe the place. Right. So, and you're talking about a level of sophistication, and the stuff that you showed, it's so beautiful, and it's got masses and masses of work behind it, right? In terms of collecting information. And like you just said, you're putting all these models together. So this is a thought experiment. Now, one thing that you pointed out was when you start to create these complex models, and you have the computational ability to work through these scenarios, you're going to be able to establish a set of rules. Now, that's really interesting, right? Because that rules that get generated allow us to start thinking about planning in different ways. And so I see that possibility, and I think it's really exciting. But in so many of the parts of the world, internationally, that say, some of us work in, and I know you do as well, we don't have that. And the rules don't necessarily translate because of all the context questions that you have, pointed to. So just a couple of thoughts about trying to get to those questions.
Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, some of the work that we're doing is only going to work in certain urban contexts, at least now. And I absolutely agree. Data is disproportionate as well, right? Whether it's global south divides or other ways of really thinking about small versus medium or large cities and what they really have that can be used to do any of this kind of work or even different work. We're working, for example, with Slum Dwellers International in Sub-Saharan Africa to try to help them understand what climate risk might look like there, and the data available to really customize, local regional scale projections is very different and requires to do a lot of thinking about what's possible there. Similarly, we're trying to understand the way in which climate may impact mobility and migration in Latin America with IDB, with the International Development Bank. And there, again, the question has been from the beginning about data, because it's very hard to really even understand what recent movements have been, who's been migrating to what city from where. And without more granular information, it's very hard to say what that might be, despite the colleagues that we're working closely with this on there and the ProPublica and New York Times articles that have said, this is what it looks like. And the scientists behind that will tell you, that's kind of back of the envelope kind of work so far. We still don't really have the data we need to be very precise or accurate about that, accurate in particular. So just to underscore, I don't have much to add really, other than the data is very different, information is very different, and in some cases, we're not going to be able to move in any short period of time away from being on the ground and talking to people and understanding that. And yet, and this is not because I think this will solve all our problems, but the massive amount of use of WhatsApp and other kinds of social media in non-US kinds of locations is full of information. I think Linda brought up a really important point about how that information can be misused if it's more available and we mine it. That might be important for planning, but could also be important for increasing the status quo in certain areas, or even doing other more harmful things. And actually, we have a paper on systemic risks of data and AI that just came out this morning, exactly on those points, which I'd love to share with you. And I think that's a serious issue that we have to be very serious about.
Thank you so much for everything. I couldn't hear.
Thanks for the great questions. I really appreciate it.
So I think I have to come here to say thank you. Thanks so much. I hope to see you.
Likewise. And I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person today. That would have been more fun.
Hi, I had a question because you started your presentation with the hopes of moving us all toward a good Anthropocene. And I kind of was curious about your thoughts on the one we're maybe on and maybe the bad Anthropocene. And thinking about especially heat in New York City and how the physical environment itself makes that danger much more acute, especially for low-income folks and the people you mentioned were especially at risk. And the projections you were showing, like into 2080, and like the way that things get much more extreme and more dangerous, knowing that we as a species and a people have not had a long history of acting in the interests of other humans, especially humans that don't hold economic power. I'm curious to think if there is already a conversation about things like climate migration and relocation, or if these things can't get done and they can't mitigate the heat problems, like what happens then? So I guess it's a bit of a speculative question, but I'm curious if this is part of the work and thinking you've already done.
It's definitely something I think a lot about. Thank you for the question. And one of the things I've been saying for a few years, but I feel like it is only heard by, you know, what do you call it, speaking to the choir, right? It's only heard by the people who are saying the same thing, which is that if we take the climate projections seriously, even very optimistic scenarios, that we're going to have to aggressively invest in adaptation at the level at which we're investing in mitigation, which many, you know, carbon zero, carbon neutrality, you know, carbon mitigation approaches, which I think many of us would argue are not at the level they should be either. And yet there's an order of magnitude difference in the level of political investment, of financial investment in adaptation as there is into really trying to decrease carbon impacts. And the amount of carbon that's built into the system already, right? And what we're going to see in the near term in terms of climate change impacts that aren't going to be able to be reversed in a decade or two, even if we're massively aggressive on drawing down CO2 emissions, which there are many very good signals, you know, that are showing that we might be able to do much better than we're doing right now, but they all have to be in play. That tells me that the investments on the adaptation resilience side have got to be extremely aggressive and very fast, and we're not on that pathway right now. So, you know, that's, I guess, a message that we're really trying to elevate with a lot of this work is that, you know, it's not about trying to tell, you know, dire narratives of these dystopian hot futures, or, you know, hurricane-driven flooding on the coast of New York or other coastal areas, except that if we don't take that seriously, then the level of adaptation that's needed is not going to be invested in. And I think that's just a massive undertaking that we really have to get serious. And that means, you know, at the federal level, at the state level, at the city level, in our country, and it means similar kinds of approaches in other countries. I think the thing I also want to say, though, is, I mentioned this at the outset, is there's a lot of incredible work that's happening, and a lot of it is in urban areas that are innovating solutions at all scales, that are innovating adaptation solutions at local community neighborhood scales, at citywide scales. And one project that we've been working on with a number of colleagues, especially driven out of the Stockholm Resilience Center, is called the Seeds of a Good Anthropocene project. You can check this out at seedsgoodanthropocene.net or something. And we're really trying to collect there the narratives and stories of amazing, innovative, and transformative actions that communities all around the world are doing as a way of really amplifying and helping us all learn from each other about what can work. Not everything will be translatable to different urban contexts, right? Some things are very unique, but some of these might be very generalizable and scalable. And how can we use the narratives of really amazing positive work that people and communities all around the world are doing as a way for us to try to start scaling up adaptation and resilience at the level that they're going to be needed. And in fact, I would argue at the level they're already needed right now.
So I had a question about the questions that other groups of, you know, people who see these data sets respond to. For example, like this is an academic setup, and a lot of us are able to understand, you know, the different maps and the data and things like that. But I'm especially curious about when you present this to, say, the government or like other, you know, bodies or agencies which actually can affect these changes. What are the questions that they ask, and you know, how do they respond to such data? Because a lot of times, and especially in the global South context, since you said you worked internationally, because like I mean, the mayor of New York would be a lot more open to like seeing these changes and how important it is, like crucial it is to like incorporate these to like make the changes happen. But then what is your experience with other groups of people who you've made presentations to like this, and what do you do differently, or do you do it differently?
Thanks. Great question. And I'll say that one thing that I do differently, which I may have overdone for all of you, which is not tell so many stories at once. I think because there's a lot of questions that come with this, and I knew we had some time to unpack some of this. And so I think one of the ways to sort of approach this in other context is to maybe start with a pretty simple narrative and then just let the questions come. And also not to layer so many bits of information simultaneously, which I'm sort of expecting that everyone here can handle, and I can tell you can, because you're asking really great questions and picking some things apart, which are great. That's what I was hoping for. On the other hand, I don't know if I've had all the kinds of experiences that you are maybe suggesting in terms of places that I presented. And so, yes, we presented this kind of work in places like San Juan, Puerto Rico. We've presented some, this kind of work in Beijing, for example, or some other places. But I think there's still probably tend to talk to a crowd that has a certain level of technical ability, and maybe that's just a limitation of my own network or where I have the opportunity to talk about some of the work that we're doing. But I suspect that there's a number of ways in which what I've presented here would not work in other contexts, and would really need a very different way of talking. And I find some of the ways to do this is to not have any slides, is to simply, have a conversation, and or even if you're giving a presentation, to do this in a way that's not visual, so that you can really get into the kinds of difficult questions that we all need to be asking and discussing.
Hello, Dr. Mac. Thanks for your presentation. Very great and very cool maps. I will add some technique details through email. But I want to ask, how do you anticipate the future use of these cool maps? Would it be a standardized step before municipality make any like investment on climate adaptation, like environmental impact review, or justification of government's behavior when faced with public suspicion, or rubrics to like restrict the private developers? And talking of internationally, how do you perceive the difference? Would it vary? Would the application vary differently in different regions and different contexts?
Well, I think on the latter point, absolutely, is the application, and whether this is even useful as a way to think about, prioritizing various adaptation responses, whether this is useful in different contexts is really going to depend. And as the last question I think brought up, there probably are some locations where this kind of spatial lens or even somewhat technical lens is not necessarily useful. On the other hand, and again, I focused a lot on New York City today, in particular, as I mentioned earlier, New York City is a very data-driven decision-making kind of place, and there's these requests for this kind of information that come to academics to support their own way of thinking about how they might prioritize any particular adaptation response. And so I think the question you brought up, which is an ongoing concern, is whether or not it's used as a political justification for some other, goal or development project that we may or may not be aware of. And so, that's not something that we can control, but certainly something we want to be aware of and are concerned about in the way in which we sort of deliver or make available certain kinds of information, whether it's map-based or otherwise. So I think you brought up a lot of concerns, but when you start thinking about other urban contexts, in some cases it depends on cultural characteristics of the place, but in some cases it just depends on the individual, and whether, or a collection of individuals, and what are the questions that they're asking, and what information is really helpful to them, and what's not. And I think that's really about building relationships and doing the kinds of engagements that can help you know what you can offer and what's really not useful. Fundamentally, we're certainly not trying to shove information down people's throats. It's more, can we be useful in some of the skills that we've developed? Thank you.
I think that was the last of our questions. Okay. So why don't we give Timon a big round of applause? Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'll ask Alexis, as our assistant here, to look up some of the information that you shared. Or you probably have a personal or professional website that we can go to as well, so that you guys all have access, easy access to a lot of the different works that we just shared today, so that we can explore it at our own leisure. Thank you so much, and I really look forward to connecting with you further out into it. And thank you so much for presenting today.
I do too. Thanks so much, Linda, for inviting me. It was really a pleasure to be here. And thank you to everyone for such excellent questions and really kind of digging in deeply on some of these issues. There's so much more we could talk about. And I wish we could now go out for lunch or something afterwards and talk further. So I hope we find a way to do that before too long.
Sounds great. Take care. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye. Thank you.